All right, everybody, you guys can hear, right? All my phones are all out, so. This is the tax accountant panel.
Yes.
We're here for world building because we are fantasy sci-fi writers. We're the cool guys, not like the romance in the books. So, no, I'm just kidding, they're all wonderful authors as well, but we are the cool guys. So what we're gonna do is, I have a few questions that we're gonna go through the panel with and try to answer for you. Probably do that for half the session, and then I'm sure you guys have questions as well. We'll try to answer them as much as we can. If you have questions during that time, please try to keep it to general questions and not like specific to like something that you're working on and stuff like that. We can always answer them at our tables because we're going to be out there for the rest of the day. We'll be glad to talk to you. How this will go, we'll do a brief introduction of each of us, and then we'll jump right in. So I'll start off. I'm Mike Squartrino. I'm the author of the Overlord's Fantasy Book Series. It's a 4-book set that's complete. Don't have to worry about me writing and not finishing. It's a big seller. And I'm also the president of the Association of Rhode Island Authors and the Expo committee chairman, so if things go terribly wrong, it's all my fault. But let's hope things go good. But I live in Tiverton, and I'm an engineer by day because you do have to have a day job to make some money. So writing is fun, but you know, we're not all Stephen King. So that's me.
I'm Donovan Lewis. My book is The Balefire Express. My first book, it just came out in September. This is also my first panel. I'm the first time with a microphone in front of me, so I apologize in advance. But I'm definitely on the fantasy side, and I am a woodworker by trade. I'm going to show you some stuff I believe that I made.
So my name is Peter O'Donnell. My degree was in journalism and creative writing, which is why I'm now a firefighter. I've got 4 novels out and one picture book that's about my job as a firefighter that I also illustrated. The first book was set in a fictitious version of the town that I work in, which is kind of weird that I just happened to start working there, but it's a pirate story. And I won Best New Author in 2019 from Story Monster Magazine for that.
Hi, my name is Paul Magnan. I am the author of a 4-book series, The Q the Unknown. It's set in a land that's literally surrounded by hell, and hell is closing in very fast. You know, like Mike, it's a 4-book series, it's complete, and so you don't have to worry about another one coming out. And I also have a short story collection called Veering from the Straight and Narrow, and the stories do fare from the straight and narrow. They encompass some mythology retold, some fairy tales retold, and just basic horror and dark fantasy themes of mine. So I live in Pawtucket. My day job is an authorization representative for a medical supply company, and I'm very proud and happy to be here with everyone today.
As you can see, we don't want to scare anybody away, but keep writing. You never know what can happen. So. But as you know, as we said, we're in sci-fi and fantasy, so a big thing in that is we need to create a world. And worlds can be anything from just an area of land that you're on, or they can be universes like in Star Wars and things like that. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to my illustrious panelists and say, first question would be, what aspects of world building do you use when creating a world or universe?
Well, I'll start. World building is fun, but you're also going to have like a set of rules you got to set for yourself. You have to make sure that whatever is happening in your world is consistent. You can't just fly off the handle. I mean, there's creativity, which is good, but you can't go completely off the board logically. You have to have some sort of sense, and a lot of that too is character driven, I believe. As long as the characters are there and they follow through, it's going to work out. It really is.
So for me, with science fiction, so my series here is science fiction. It's young adults, so the characters are young in the story, and it starts on Earth, and things kind of expand out from there. But the one thing was what I wanted to do with this book is I wanted to try and get as much of the science right as I could, which is not really, it's funny because the 2 other books that I had written were historical. So I did a ton of research for him. So I was like, well, I'm gonna write science fiction. I don't have to do as much research this time. I was so wrong. I deep dived into so many different physicists and just even trying to do the math of the way worlds move around each other. I gave up. I was just like, I'll just smudge that because it's just not gonna work for me. But although apparently we have an astrophysicist in the group now,
yes,
and
I
I've already reached out to him. So, but so from you start where we are today, but then as you expand out to what might be the next step, and the next step in that technology, and there's a lot of research out there, things like weapons tech and things like that. Like railguns show up in a lot of science fiction because that's something the military's actually developed. Mass accelerators, where basically they're considering weapon systems that can blast an asteroid at a planet. It's horrible, but that is stuff that they're doing. Even things like quantum physics, to where the movement through these. So you have to do the research and then build off of that. And it's kind of like when you watch Star Trek and you're like, oh man, this looks so dated, they got it wrong. It's like, well, that's what they were working forward from at that time.
You let everybody in.
So.
That's my son.
So the elements of world building in science fiction are very interesting, and they keep you on your toes for that reason. Now, the historical fiction, there's always an element of magic in there, and I agree that even when you're dealing with magic, you have to have certain rules in your head as a writer. You don't necessarily have to explain them all to the reader because that is tedious as hell. Like, I'm a big fan of Neil Gaiman. The thing I love about, I don't know if anybody's ever read The Ocean at the End of the Lane, but it's brilliant, it's beautiful, great, American Gods, beautiful writing. He doesn't explain to you why these things are the way they are. He's kind of got an idea in his head. And, he's not going to give that away to you. But it builds that mystery and that element. And I think anytime you're, not to crap on other stuff, but I think sometimes when you over-explain the magic system to your reader, it's like it takes the magic away from you. Like let them let it be wonderful, basically.
For the fantasy side, I would definitely just to build on that of internal consistency. I like to have a cheat sheet of this is all the rules of my world. So I kind of refer back to that because for me the biggest thing is when they pull out some spell in the last quarter. It's wait, you could do that all along. Why didn't you do that earlier? And then for world building with magic, I always find give yourself limitations, then use that creatively. So instead of just having a spell that can do anything, if you have someone where it's their whole shtick is they can control water and that's it, now every problem is going to require a water-based solution, even if that's not necessarily what you want out of that. So if they're being chased, now they have to think of okay, I'm going to freeze the ground or create a mist, and that creativity is a lot more compelling for the reader, I find, because they're going to think what they would do, than someone who just has very over-branching, can kind of do anything.
And when I'm going to take it just a higher level, mine's an epic fantasy, so you need to create, I need to create the world they live in, so are there deserts, are there mountain ranges, are there physical things, and I fill in all of the towns and villages, and then from there, now you get your characters. Well, your characters live from different places and things like that, and then you got monsters, and you got other factions and armies are here, and you have treasures are found here, and so this is your world. Remember, you are the author. You know everything. The people that are reading don't. So have a really good idea of what your world is about, where the things are, who the peoples are, what are the governments, what are the religions, what are all that kind of stuff, and you keep that to yourself. And then you show it through, I like to show it through my characters. But sometimes you do have to have references and things like that, where your main character has his or her traits and they come from a certain area and they know, I grew up in Bristol, I know where everything is in Bristol, Rhode Island. But some of my friends who live in other parts of the state, I don't know their hometowns. So if you have characters and they're okay, we're going to go on a journey into these mountains, and wow, I grew up around the area, we used to go, so now you have another reference point. So when you're writing, you can kind of keep that in mind. So your world is a physical place, but your characters are the ones that can drive it. And now you have a good story. So going on kind of what we've started, let's go a little bit deeper in how do you make an unbelievable world believable? And what I mean by that is, and we're gonna touch on magic again, but magic, we don't have magic in this world that we live in. We may think we do, but we really don't. But how do you take certain things in a sci-fi or a fantasy world that are unbelievable, but how do you make them believable?
All right, in addition to the consistency that was mentioned earlier, I think a lot of it comes down to character development. If you can relate to the characters, then you can relate more to the world that they're in. It makes it believable. And as long as it's, again, creativity is great, but if you fly too far off the rails, the reader is not going to relate to any of it, and chances are you're going to lose the reader. So if you make your characters believable, give them motivation, give them emotion, give them character arcs that people can relate to, then I find that everything else falls into place.
So like I said, for the historical fiction, in which I have some magic and mystery, some of that, so a lot of this actually has Irish mythology in it, which is kind of something that I've always been fascinated by. So I would say some of that magic might even be real. You know, so they're looking for his pirate treasures on the island of Tirnanog, which, you know, only shows up, and then you build off the legends that you've already heard, but at the same time, there's things like, you know, the legend that it was based on was a character named Oisin who was taken away by the Sea King's daughter. These are the actual Irish legends. Taken away to the Sea King's daughter to the magical island, and when he came back, she told him not to touch the ground, and when he fell off his horse, all the years that had, you know, that had passed came back to him. So it's like, so I tried to take that sort of magic and build it into you know, a story that would be set today. But to make the believable unbelievable in science fiction is quite different, because it's you've got to kind of have a reason why things are. You have to have, you know, like there's a creature in the second book that's a composite life form. So it's basically different fish that communicate and work within each other through a link. So it's basically a school of fish that got really smart. So, you know, and that's kind of a hard concept to grasp at first, because this is a character that's up and walking around, but it's like, it's not something that you wouldn't necessarily see in nature, it's just taken to that next level, you know. So when you develop creatures and animals, you have to look at, or aliens basically, you only have the Earth really to go into, to look at, you know, what they're, you know, the natural kingdom. And you try to find those little things, and you try to like maybe tweak it and say, well, what if? Obviously, but you have to start at, like, what was it? There was a book where they made super smart spiders, and they created this entire culture of spiders, and it's the guy, yeah, and the guy was he was a biologist, and the depth with which this guy understood spiders, it was more frightening than the book itself. So it's very different between science fiction and fantasy as far as the way you have to develop these things, but you know, it's all imagination, and just trying to make things make sense.
I think the real magic is the friends we made along this kid. I swear to God, it's not. For me on the fantasy side is, if you're in a fantasy setting, find a real world setting that kind of mirrors it, and at least use that as your basis. So if you start to just make stuff up, someone will catch on to it, of like, you know, they had to mine through the sandstone to reach the gold. Someone will be like, actually, that's not how that works. So the more you can keep it leveled as like, even just like the animals and like the different types of trees, like those are little things that don't really matter individually, but overall, like when you start talking about those different things, it builds in a picture that's a lot stronger. It will keep you from, it lets you focus on the changes you want to make and not worry much about all these little inconsistencies that you have to worry about standing out.
Cool. Yeah, with I write fantasy, and even with the science fiction, it kind of like, you know, I always say fantasy and science fiction are the same, so science fiction just has technology and fantasy doesn't. So when you try to make something believable, my stories have dragons. So right off the bat, if you don't buy dragons, you know, okay, it's going to be tough for you. But there's other things, like my characters get beat up. I run them through the ringer. And like in my world, if you're a human, and you fall from 100 feet, you're probably going to die. Okay, like you wouldn't here. might break a neck and whatever, you're gonna die. And that's what should happen. Unless you have something like you have, I don't know, wings or whatever, or a cape that can turn into whatever. So all these things are not believable. But if you bring it across as believable, then it'll work. And what Paul said, consistency is very, very important. One of the things that, we know the Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger movies that came out in the 80s and good stuff. And, here's Stallone with one machine gun and grenades, and there's 1,000 Russians coming and he kills them all. That's not believable. You can't do that. Oh, yeah.
Predator is loosely based on my life.
But it's stuff like that you want to keep consistent. So keep things consistent. Like I have elves and I have dwarves and I have dragons, and I made a race of creatures that are like ogres, that are like flip sides of humans. But they have their own characteristics, and as long as you're consistent, that's good. Like Donovan said, you don't want to say, what, you had this capability all along, and on page 500 of 520 pages, it comes out. So, just be aware of keeping it real. Okay?
I could just interject one more thing. As you said earlier, Mike, to make the world more relatable, have in your mind, a government system, maybe a religious system. I mean, it doesn't have to be necessarily anything that's in this world, but as long as there's some sort of structure that way that people can relate to, that helps make your fantasy world more believable.
And speaking of that, like mine is a whole bunch of towns and villages that govern themselves. But the gist of the story, without giving too much away, is for Harrison, who's my main character, is a way to reunite humanity. So it's kind of a noble cause and stuff. But it's ways to keep things together. Here's one that should be pretty good. How do you incorporate myths or folklore in your world? Think the Jedi Knights or the Sith and stuff like that.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, my world is surrounded by, well, I call it Dis, which is another word for hell. Aspects of the Inferno, and I try to take aspects of Paradise Lost, plus other aspects of not just Judeo-Christian, but other cultures of how they believe in an afterlife and such a bad place would be like. I try to incorporate that as best as I can. So that's as far as mythology goes, in my short story collection, I got a few examples of that, but again, have fun with it. Have fun with it. Keep it grounded, but have fun. I mean, that might sound like an oxymoron, but you can do that. So, if I imagine some of you here are potential writers, and again, the first rule is have fun, enjoy it, because it's a great thing.
So I think one of the most fascinating things about literature is when mythology shows up again and again. It does it, I mean, as you talk about Star Wars, when they talk about, the hero with 1,000 faces, it's like anybody that's interested in writing, I suggest you go back to some of that stuff and you try to read and research it. So there's a race within this science fiction series that basically they're taking elements of Viking mythology. It's 1,000 years in human history, 1,000 years forward in human history. So a lot of these things have been forgotten. There's a cataclysm at the end of book one, who wrote that. But there's a cataclysm and things get forgotten. But certain histories still remain. People still hold on to certain things. And that's one thing that I kind of played with a little bit, is that the idea that, if digital media broke down, if we had no way of storing information anymore, it's one of those things where you could look at a stone that's got a 3,000-year inscription. I mean, you just came back from Italy. You see things that are there permanently, but yet your CDs from college don't play anymore. It's like so some of these stories that we've had as a species for thousands of years, they still come forward, and it's interesting to see how they repeat too, and that it's not necessarily one culture or another. There's certain things that humanity does in every system that we've set up. Even on isolated islands, we have a tendency to create elitists. We have a tendency to, not necessarily share our wealth. We like heroes. We like people that come up. So those stories come back again and again. So I try to build in some of that mythology, but these stories can also be used from, one of the interesting things about religion is in the way that it can be used to sort of change a society. It's one of the most controlling factors in our society. So that I kind of explore that in the science fiction series. And then obviously the two standalone historical fictions that I have, Irish mythology, I already said I kind of deep dove on that. And then the other one that's coming out this spring is about World War II in Paris. And I play a lot with, because all the masters used to paint Romans and Greeks and stuff like that. So some of the mythology came out into that as well, because a little bit of the magic that'll be in that will be related to a goddess from Greek mythology.
Definitely the myths and stuff like forms the basis that you're going to build off of for the rest of everything. So my book is post-apocalyptic in the sense of like 1,000 years after the bomb drop sort of thing. And you got to start kind of building like what happened in that interim. So in this, okay, we've got zombies, we've necromancy running around, and eventually someone's like, maybe nukes will fix this, because unsurprisingly. And now humanity's just kind of like barely holding on the edge. So you start to think of, like, we've got people today who are like, I am God, I have magical powers. Now imagine if like you actually have magic in your world, how it's going to split people. I know some people are going to take, like you said, like a religious bent to it. Like whatever you're putting as the basis of this world or the magic is going to be taken differently by different cultures. I think one of the best ways to differentiate them is to having a bunch of cultures look at the same thing and all take different meaning from it. And it's a great way, at least for me, to draw very fine lines between them.
When I do mythologies, I always like to say, okay, I have an iceberg. Okay, and when you have an iceberg, you only see the tip of the iceberg, right? So my mythologies and my storylines, I know, I'm the writer, and I don't want to tell you, the audience, everything, because you're going to hold me to that. Okay, so what you do is you can kind of give a little bit out to the audience, the 10%. And you can always draw back on the mythologies. The mythologies are always, like you were saying, well, this was 2,000 years ago. We didn't have any documentation. It was lost. So a myth is something that, well, might have happened. Like, was there really a minotaur? Or is that a myth? We don't have any fossils of any, but they were convinced that there were minotaurs in the labyrinths. So in like my story, I have a couple where first, 1,000 years ago, the kings who ruled the land, there were 4 kings, and they all disappeared on one infamous day. They were gone, and the treasures disappeared. So, the name of my first book is Legend of the Treasure, because over the course of 1,000 years, no one has found this bounty of these kings who disappeared. However, they found some tangible clues. I'm not going to give too much away. But obviously I use these clues to go forward. So this mythology, I just keep throwing out there to people, like, oh, here's this clue, they find this, they find that, they find this. And then you can start piecing it together. So you, the audience, are like, oh, I found this one piece, but I know everything else. And it's over a course of 4 books. So I'm not going to give you everything in book 1. It'd be like, oh, they found all this stuff, and they get book 2. Oh, where did this come from? It was part of this treasure, and it was found with this. And then there was another one I have, the prophecy, which is very vague, but the prophecy says that brothers will reunite the land. I'm going to leave it at that. So in my thing, when you have mythologies and you're the writer, you know everything. And just give it a little bit at a time. Because there will be those people who are like, on page 300, he found this sword, this catacombs, and they didn't have it there. It was actually found in. Okay, you're right. You're right. So you're gonna have to be consistent. So keep that in mind. We're gonna go back to guys to talk about magic. So let's dive into magic. So in science fiction and fantasy, especially fantasy is very magical and stuff like that. It's a magical place. In science fiction, you can think of let's face it, the Jedis and the Sith incorporate the Force. Well, the Force is a magical kind of thing. If you think about it, they can do things that magicians would do. Like Gandalf can do certain things. Well, so can Luke Skywalker. I mean, it's kind of the same but different. It's a different genre. So, how do you incorporate magic in your worlds? And be specific on like how you use your magic, because I think a lot of people see magic, but like how important is it? How powerful is it? How do you keep it together?
In my fantasy series, I don't call it magic, I call it awareness, because it's been said that people only use a certain portion of their brain, a very small bit, and a large part of it is untapped. And that's part of the mythology I use in my books. The main character discovers what I call his awareness, and he can alter his reality to a certain extent. And the more he practices, the more he works on it, the more he does, which he's going to need because, hell's knocking at the door. So that's the magic, that's what I used in my series. It's not something from the outside, it's not an outside force that you can grab and use. It's something within your own mind that you harness and you can use that may appear as magic to others, but it's really, I don't want to call it scientific, but it's something that very plausibly can happen.
So like I said, I got a little bit of magic in the two historical books, but in the science fiction, so it was Isaac Asimov? No, it was Arthur C. Clarke that talked about how like more advanced technology might seem like magic to you. So within the story, it's called The Giant Shadow. That's going to be the name of the whole series. There are beings that, like I said, that have more advanced technology. And realistically, I haven't broken down in the series so far like what those advantages are. I've alluded to the way that they can move through the forces of these giant imperial ships and destroy them. And really what it comes down to is speed. Because speed kills, as we all know. So there's a speed limit for what the human body can take. And as we talk about spaceships and how fast they can go, when you watch Star Trek, they go really fast. Why? Because they have inertial damage. What is an inertial damage? Nobody knows. Nobody knows what an inertial damage is, but it's basically so that way if you're going really fast that way, and you turn really fast that way, and you're not paced that way. So that's an advantage on a battlefield. When you study the history of war, these little things that don't seem like that big a deal, these little jumps in technology, it gives you a huge advantage. And that's, so I play around with that, where these things might seem magical, but maybe they just don't see that these things are just moving faster than you, and they can do that. They can take a corner that you can't take. They can dodge something that you can't, because, physics is physics, and we haven't broken those rules yet. I mean, we might by. So it's interesting too, because like when you're writing science fiction and you are looking at that next step, sometimes it's overwhelming because as a species, we're on a cusp of all these changes as they talk about these things. As people are talking about putting electrodes in our brains and things like that. So you one of the things as I was designing this series, as I was doing the world building in the series, is I wanted a way to gate technology back a little bit. So the advanced species is basically slowing the development to keep people from developing more dangerous technology. That's kind of the gist of what their game is. Not to give everything away in the series, but it's like, and part of that is because I wanted to tell a space opera that I can sink my teeth into, that, I'm not, I finished reading this book called Blindsight where they were talking about human consciousness, and it was deep, it was really, and it's, as you're trying to tell a story about these 5 main characters, sometimes when you get too far into the weeds of what's next, you can lose the character. So you and that's really where the rules of world building become so important, because it's like you have to find ways to say, all right, this is what we have, nothing more, this is where we stop, so.
For me, really baking that magic into the world. So I kind of mentioned before how 1,000 years later, we've been kicked back to like 1700s technology. We are flush with zombies. And the magic that we have is balefire, which is this ever-burning purple flame. As long as you and a zombie are both in the light, you can control it to an extent, kind of the same way that you could like give commands to a well-trained animal. And you could do lots of fun things, like for example, get it to like pull a sled, which is what the Balefire Express is. It's a bunch of zombies rigged up like sled dogs, pulling a bunch of sleds everywhere. But the fire part is interesting because, well, fires can go out, and now all of a sudden your sled dogs are very, very hungry, or the light can get blocked and lead to a lot of interesting things. And for me, trying to find ways to deepen that complexity, like I wanted these to be more than like Walking Dead. I wanted them to retain aspects of who they were as people, which are like super useful, because if he was a soldier, awesome. He like kind of remembers how to use a sword, he can defend me, great. But the problem is, if you just like pick one up on the side of the road and you don't know what it does, you might wake up one day and it's like, maybe it was a chef and it's caught like a squirrel and it's trying to like get your camp on fire, trying to make like risotto, because that's what it is. It's a lot of just like, oh, well, my character, Winona, like, I want her to be like a badass heroine, and she's kind of just like a very exasperated mom a lot of the time. It's just like, so finding those ways to be like, okay, we have like an unlimited workforce, but also might eat us, and how that will change how your world functions and how it progresses.
Yeah, I have the prototypical epic fantasy world. I was a DM back in the day, so it has a heavy D&D flair. So it's that kind of magic, so I think a lot of people know what that is. But my problem with magic and fantasy is a lot of times these magicians and wizards and stuff are extremely strong. And they can overtake sometimes too much. Too much. So I try to scale it back where, you know, they can be powerful in a certain way, but they can't overwhelm a situation. Things like that. And then when the magician that I have, our characters, you know, the main characters find something and it's magically encrypted, they can't read it, so they search for a mage. And when I was writing this when I was younger, I made the mage old. He was 50, but now that I'm 58, he's not that old. But he was old compared to the 20-year-old warriors and stuff. And, well, he hasn't practiced in a while, so he's rusty. And a lot of times they get into situations where like, you need to create a fireball to learn and it doesn't work and stuff. But as the story evolves, he gets his things back and everything like that, and his magic becomes stronger. But also they meet other, you know, people who are practicing magicians and mages and stuff like that. But nothing that's too overwhelming. Because the worst thing you can have is somebody that can destroy everything. And then when the opportunity arises for, well, we got the Rambo situation, there's 1,000 of them coming. Okay, we're good now. No, that's not fun. You want to be able to utilize things and not be overbearing. So that's the way I do my magic. I think we all have our same kind of traits and things like that. I'm going to do one more question, and then we'll open it up for questions. And this one is, do you incorporate any modern world traits in your fictitious world?
Yes, I do. I don't have a lot of sci-fi elements. In fact, there's none. In fact, there's really no computers in my world, but there are firearms, there are combustion engines. It's almost like the 1950s, 60s type technology that's in this book and the others. So I try to incorporate that, to make it, a little bit more relatable. And as far as the other modern elements, this isn't exactly a modern element, but the peoples in this land and surrounded by hell are very contentious because 1,000 years ago they were all brought together, unified under the sword of an Alexander the Great type figure. And in all that time there's been peace, but it's been very tenuous because these people really, even though they're forced to coexist, they really still don't like one another. And sadly, that's kind of like the world today, and even this country today is. If you think about this world, our world being surrounded by hell, do you believe that all the people in this world would suddenly realize that, hey, we're all humans, we can do this. I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to that. I still think that. And of course, hell would do their best to make us fight amongst one another, to weaken us when they really come in. And it's basically up to, actually not just my main character, I have a couple of main characters here that try their best to truly unify people, and it's not easy. It's not easy. And just modern attitudes, I don't know, human nature really hasn't changed in thousands of years, sadly, maybe you might say. But I do incorporate some modern elements. I just don't go full out with, there are none of these, which I'm very glad. But there are some modern things that, it's kind of help things move along in my world.
So the characters are from today, basically. But they've wound up on the other side of a wormhole, basically, to where they still have, they still have their memories from Earth and whatnot. So there's one character that she's kind of my favorite to write, named Anita, who's British, of Indian descent, genius level, and she says the one thing that she misses the most is movie references. So modern things like that fit into it. But like I said, it's after a cataclysm where the Earth is gone now, and so there are little snippets of what was left behind. But when you start talking about distance and things like that, some technology may not be as useful at that time. So that's pretty much it.
For me, being post-apocalyptic, the big thing is what's still going to be around in 1,000 years, and looking at what has been built 1,000 years ago. Most of the stuff, you have train tunnels and things like that, but a lot of stuff is not going to be around, and kind of finding the right place for that. For the non-physical stuff, I was definitely going to write in a modern vernacular. I was going to go Old English, but trying to stay away from modern references. We don't realize how many of the things we say, damn kids with your potters and all, the things that we use and not even realize that someone without a cultural basis that we have no idea what we're talking about. So finding that way to speak in a modern way, but avoid those pitfalls that are actually super, super specific to our current time and culture.
For myself, again, it's an epic fantasy, so there are no modern things, like machineries and stuff like that. However, I try to take how governments and armies would worked and trained and things like that. So it's more of from what I see from what our countries do and interface with the governments is more of what I use. So I do look at that, and I do a lot of ancient history with how armies were constructed and how they would go into attack formations and things like that. So I would use that kind of modern warfare, but in a fantasy realm. So we don't have tanks, we don't have machine guns, we don't have airplanes, we have dragons, we have some other things. So that's all I do in mine. We probably have a good 20 minutes, so let's open it up to questions, and we'll try to get everybody, but we have to be done by 12, so we'll go from this way and around.
Hi. So I guess this is kind of a two-parter question, but it shouldn't be too long. So I'm curious how you keep track of everything. So let's say you have to do research either into a mythology or a technology, or even keeping track of your own world. What kind of are you keeping notes, backstories, outlines, that kind of thing? And does that ever get in the way? You have if you're only showing the tip of the iceberg, how much more of the iceberg is there in prep time and things like that? And then the other part is your writing style. So I tend to be a pantser. I write by the seat of my pants, right? I'm not that much of a plotter. But how do you, so if you are a pantser or a plotter, how do you work in keeping track of all that backstory stuff? Because I could be writing and then all of a sudden, I don't know what I'm going to write tomorrow, but I need to build a world and keep track of that world. And then I might get to the end of the story and realize, I need to rewrite the whole thing or something like that, so.
I'll go the first one. I'm a plotter, because I'm an engineer by day, so I'm very analytical, and I don't know how you write as an answer. I don't know how you do it.
At least the first draft would be
Yeah.
a pantser.
So what I definitely outline my stories, and then I have, and it's good, your major bullet points and then your subplots and all that stuff, and what I do is I write from one point to the next. So I don't know what the story is gonna do. That's the creative side, that's what drives my storyline. But as for like the mythologies and everything, I have my Microsoft Word document that I'm writing, and I do chapter by chapter. And then I have another one open. And that's the one where, I need to remember this, blah, 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 blah. And I put all this stuff in. And there's a side folder in my directory structure that says stuff. And in the stuff folder is where all of the the stuff goes in. The mythologies, the character bios, all that kind of stuff. And anything that I think I'm going to need to remember, so I don't have to go through 500 pages of, when you write Microsoft Word, this 420-page book is like 600 and something pages. And so if you have to go through all that to find what you did, it works. So I would suggest having something to jot down your notes, and if you can make them, those notes not be so chaotic and they can be kind of organized, that's what I would do. You guys do it?
Yes, I'm both a pantser and a plotter. I do write an outline. I know how it begins. I know how it ends. Whatever happens in the middle is just a basic outline. It's like, hey, whatever happens. So for me, keeping everything straight, yes, I do keep notes, but I find that if you write every day, it keeps it fresh in your mind. However, if you can't, once you finish, you go back to that first draft, and everyone's first draft is always awful. And you go through it, you go, oh God, oh God. That's when you do some of those corrections. That's when you say, oh boy, I really did something bad here. So that's what it is. I mean, once you go through the first draft and you make your own round of self-edits, and then you have a second draft, and that's when you go out to your beta readers or editors, and because they will find things that you did not find very easily. They will say, hey, what about this part right here? And that's why we have beta readers.
So for me, especially with the science fiction series, because it is going to be a 7-book series, and there's clues that I drop in the first book that won't get paid off until the 7th book. And so I know what's going to happen in each one of those books. And like Mike's stuff file, I've got about 4 or 5 of those. Like there's one that's like combat defined. This one is the days of the week, because it's like they're planets, they're moons moving around a gas giant. So like the days work differently. And it's like, so I have to have those things, I don't have to give them to the reader, but they've got to be in my head for how long a time period is and stuff like that, which is a lot. It's definitely like things I have to pull back open. And I've also got 1,000 years, so not to go too far off, but so this series was the one that I thought about all the time when I was a kid. Like as I was walking in the woods and stuff like that, and I was writing short stories, my first couple of short stories, this series was building in my head at that time period. And it's been a lot of different things. And what I wanted to do initially with it was kind of like have it almost be like a Conan series, to where like it was about a wandering warrior that, going through these different worlds. So the worlds came first and the story came second. And it was, oftentimes I find, I love science fiction, but sometimes when you step off in a science fiction book and you're not familiar with the world, it can be really difficult to, by the time you're into the story and you're really enjoying it, like Ancillary Justice was one, I don't know if anybody read that one, to where the character was like a drone off a spaceship and she was the last survivor off the spaceship, but she's got all the thoughts and memories of the spaceship. And it's like, it took a while for me to catch up with the world that they were in. So that's why the story followed to where the 5 characters are from Earth. And it's like, so I wanted you to have a good place to step off from, because I'm going to take you to some weird freaking places, like, because it's been playing in my head for 30 years, so it has to make sense. So to answer your question, I outline everything. The book that I'm working on now, it's about a 30-page outline for that book. Luckily, book 3 is with Mike's editor right now, so I can make tweaks to 3 to make sure 4 makes sense. Obviously, the further you walk out onto that diving board, the less you can go back and clean things up a little bit in the previous drafts. But I'm also lucky that I can draw a little bit, so as I'm dealing with alien creatures, I can kind of sketch them out, and I can, so I have them in notebooks too, and then, you try to put these things and codify it in some sort of organization. So there's a lot of data out there. I'm just really bad at organizing. So.
For me, I'm definitely a planner by nature of having everything outlined out, but definitely giving yourself wiggle room to allow your characters to breathe. Like, I don't know if anyone's, like you said, played Dungeons and Dragons. You only really have tangential control of what like your players are doing at any given moment. And there's a certain point where like you have your outline, you want to go A, B, C, and D, and then you get to B, and your character just like, I want to go to E. It's like, no character, we can't do that. It's like, I really want to do this. And it's kind of like winding up a toy. You can set it on a track, but at a certain point it's going to take like a hard right towards the edge of the table. And you can try to like push it back on, but I found that the scenes that came a lot more naturally for me are the ones where I kind of just wound up a character and just kind of like followed it around with a notebook. For the more technical side, I use Scrivener, which is a writing app, and it's basically, you know what Scrivener is.
I know what Scrivener is, yeah.
And it's basically just a Word document that allows you to put all your outlines and stuff in the same program. So for someone as scatterbrained as me who's going to make an outline, forget about it, start a different outline, and then realize halfway that I have 2 diverging outlines that I now have to squish together. Having everything in one place is very good for my brain.
There you have it. So that should keep you busy.
From a perspective of a world that is completely unconnected to the world that we live in real life, how do you decide how much of our world to incorporate in that world? Because something I really like, something I notice and just has become something that I think about a lot as I'm experiencing things like Lord of the Rings, Dungeons and Dragons. I'm noticing a lot of vocabulary that we know, things like miles and weeks and months. How much of, like, how do you know where to stop? Like, at what point do you decide, I'm going to use words that everyone is familiar with versus I'm going to use words that I think apply to this world?
That's okay. The reason why, this is because I was at a science fiction convention in Boston last year, and it was, the panel I was on was, what does science fiction get science wrong, right? Okay, so it's, and you take some liberties, okay, like if Pete was saying, if you're in a spaceship, physics, dictate, like if you're going at light speed and take a hard right, well, you're still going at light speed, and you're going to get splattered. But they have anti-gravity drives and stuff, so you're going to buy that because we're going to be like, all right, if we're really going to use science, and we're going to go to Alpha Centauri, well, you're going to watch us in a spaceship that probably can't go light speed, but let's say it can go light speed, and we're going to take 4.5 years to get there. Best case scenario. So we have agreed that warp drive, and we can jump in the Star Wars, we go hyperdrive and all that stuff. So you buy into that. The weeks, the months, the miles, inches, things like that.
Also time zones.
And time zone, all that kind of stuff that's Earth-based. Unless you want to generate your own units of measurement and time and have that in the appendix of your book, good luck.
And then have to explain in a natural way that doesn't seem super jarring.
Right. So, and one of the hardest things, and I tell my wife this, I'm like, one of the hardest things I want to write about like a science fiction thing with an interface with an alien species, but we always give them kind of like human traits because we don't know anything else. And what if there's an alien race that comes to Earth? Well, obviously they're more advanced than we are, and do they care about money? Do they care about religion? Do they, one thing we can agree on is probably we use the same physics and math. I think we have to do that. But what I don't have any idea what they could be, and that's very hard for me to figure out. So when you say how much Earth stuff, you need to give your audience a basis of like how, like you can say, well, this planet only has 11 hours in the day, or the gravitational pull is stronger so people are smaller because of whatever. That you can do, but with like time and distances, I think you kind of have to keep it relatively Earth-based. I don't.
It's such a rabbit hole. You could really, and I mean, it's hurt my brain. It really has. To where like I said, just
That's why I
trying.
ask.
Yeah, just trying to figure out the length of days, and it's like, you know, I'm not that guy. Like, I'm not the science. I love this stuff, but I'm not the one that can do that math. And I've tried. I've really tried. So it's like, well, what's the purpose of this? It's like to tell these characters' story. You know, as much fun as this stuff is, it's like, I want you interested in Alex and Chris and these guys and this thing that they're going through, and they're trying to find their mother and they're trying to figure out where they are. And it's like, all this world building stuff, it's great, but it's window dressing compared to the story of these characters that are going through, you know, like there's one character, the one Alex that I mentioned to, he's wanted to be a soldier his entire life, and now he has an opportunity to, and he's dealing with like the post after that, after he's done that. Like, he's 18 years old, like so many kids that we send off to war. Now he's dealing with the aftershocks of doing something horrible. And it's like, you know, these are things to where, to me, that's so much more important than how long a day is, you know? So it's like, you try to set that up, and you try to set, this is the standard, but don't follow the rabbit hole too far, otherwise you'll lose the plot, you'll lose the story, you'll lose the characters.
I think you're sweating the small stuff.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the small stuff. The story and the plot lines, I think, are more important.
There's
Yeah,
more
you're-
stuff that I'm noticing just like as a reader, as a consumer of the media, you know, things like one of the things in like modern stories, modern movies that comes up a lot is like if two people are on opposite ends of the planet and, you know, they're friends or they're love or whatever, you know, one of them will call in the middle of what's the day for them, and they wake up the other person because it's midnight.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that I don't really see a lot of in worlds that are not ours.
Yeah.
And it's just, I don't know, it's just something I
Well,
think about.
one thing like what I say, buying into, like, I'm a big Star Wars guy, and whenever they go to a planet or whatever, they go and they walk out, and they can breathe, and everything's good, it's like Earth, and every planet they go to, they pretty much, you can walk out. You cannot do that. Even in physics, you know, even in our own solar system, like one of the fascinating things that I never thought of, on Mars, now we have drones flying on Mars. Well, the atmosphere is so much thinner that the wings are much bigger on these drones because it's a different pressure, it's a different way. And you think, oh my God, every place we go, we want to have a drone fly, and our own solar system is going to be completely different for each and every planet or moon we go to. They don't do that in Star Wars. They just walk off the spaceship, and there's no crushing gravity and things like that. So there's some things you are allowed to buy into. So think of that. If you, like Pete said, if you really want to get into it, then you're going to find a physicist.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, I wanted to say it takes an exceptional writer to put different measurements or different things like that and still keep the interest of their reader. The other one that really comes to mind for me is Anthony Burgess with The Clockwork Orange, because he incorporates Russian language, Russian slang, and other languages like droogs and stuff like that. And when you first start to read The Clockwork Orange, you're like, what? Huh? But Anthony Burgess is such a good writer, as you get into it, it sinks in. You know, that's not an easy thing to do. It really isn't. So, you know, that's why we do what we do.
As someone who sweats the small stuff, for me it was a lot of just figuring out like what will survive and what won't survive. So very early on, I'm like, imperial measurements are not surviving the apocalypse. The fact that like 1 foot and you get like 5,000, that's never going to survive. But like, you know, centimeters, and turns out there are decimeters between centimeters and meters, something I had to learn about. I was like, okay, that makes sense that if any of this survived, people could extrapolate measurements. So when you're looking at whatever system you're writing in, it's kind of like we talked about before, using those real world things in a smart way. And definitely, like, you can have a plan, like you said, where it's like, well, they can't breathe, and also there's heavy gravity, and also it's tidally locked. And you can do that, but each one of those is going to twist the culture in a different way and make your job harder. But more power to you if you want to go for it.
So I have an interesting question in regards to like you're like playing with different races and stuff like that between sci-fi and fantasy, what would you say would be the key elements when it comes to race building?
Next question, no.
So the key elements for me anyway, when it comes to race building is, I wanted different species in the story, but I also wanted to serve the overall purpose of the story. So for instance, like I have one race of aliens that are extreme isolations. Like they don't cooperate with each other. They don't. So and it's sort of to illustrate like this is what this society would be like. I've got like I said, the creatures that are basically a school of fish, to where like they are all about cooperation. And you know, it's the extremes, because I play a little bit, like I don't want to get into politics or anything like that, but like, because I'm a devout moderist, like in the middle. But the thing is like sometimes when you look at the extremes of government, sometimes like the further you go left or the further you go right, you wind up in the same place, which is kind of sort of something that I want to explore. So I explore that with the governments, the human governments, I explore that with the alien races. So all those aliens still serve a purpose, but then, you know, there's just also the element you want something cool. You know, you want something that like maybe is a little bit different than anybody's seen before in your story, some idea that's just kind of out there a little bit. And I think, you know, you have to kind of push your imagination to come up with something that you hope that nobody's seen before, or, you know, elements of it that are just unique to that. So I think those races, like I said, they shouldn't just be there as window dressing. They should be there to serve a purpose to your story. But then, like I said, just, you know, try to make it cool.
I really like the school fish one. Like that's such a
Yeah.
and that's the thing. Like it's so easy to fall into. It's like, well, with like sci-fi, it's like, well, the aliens that are like very willowy and they're elves, and then you have the ones that are like bulky and a warlike culture and they're orcs. So trying to find those creative ways of like thinking, like if tomorrow, if dogs became sentient, how would dog culture evolve? Or like these creatures, what you built on, like you talked about with cooperation. The physiology of these creatures, how they interact with each other, how that is going to then build up to nature culture.
For me, well, the people in my world are as diverse as our world is. But as far as like the other race, that would be the inhabitants of Dis, which I call infernals. And there's quite a variety there, but they all have one thing in common. They feed on human misery, they feed on human hatred, and they feed on humans. So.
Yeah, I think what you want to do is give them traits and keep it consistent, like we spoke about before. Give them whatever traits you want. I mean, you are the creator, so give them those traits, keep it consistent, and then go from there. I think we only have time for one more question.
So I wanted to ask, how much of your writing is the outline process? How much of it is practical, you know, I've just gone into this thing that's made creative? And then how much of your drafting process is bringing one to the other?
Yes. I do my outlines, like I was saying before, so I'll have an outline for the story, more or less. Now remember, these outlines are dynamic. Just because you put it down doesn't mean it can't change. And then I write from one point to the next, to the next, to the next. However, I do go off on tangents, because there are times when I'm like, okay, they found this part of the treasure, and now they need to get to the cave in the mountain. Well, that's 10 miles away. There can be a lot of fun stuff on a 10-mile trek in the fantasy world. So I don't know what's going to happen. And I just let my brain go, and I start writing. And then as you're going, I know I'm still going to get to that cave in the mountain. I have this really cool detour, and you know, all these things happen along the way. And as long as it doesn't detract from the story, I keep it in. And I think it works better that way. So you want to have something like, I always say that my outline keeps me a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I know where I can get to. And then the creative process takes place. But don't go too far in tangents where some of the stuff that you're writing has nothing to do with your story. It doesn't help. That ends up getting cut and goes in the stuff folder.
So for me, because it is a big series, so I have one outline that's like the master outline that's got like 2 paragraphs per book. Things that I know I need to hit in that book. And then, you know, like as a fan of the genre, there's certain scenes I want to see. There's things that I like that I want to fit into the book. And so, you know, like that, you know, by the time I get to the 5th book, there's a scene where the guy's out on an icy planet just trying to survive. You know, and I don't know how I'm going to get there to that scene. I have a vague idea how I'm going to get there, but so, you know, when before I start putting the outline down, I'll even do it to where, because it's multiple point of views as you're going from different characters, I on this last book, what I did was I broke it down by the character. So I know this chapter is an immediate chapter. This chapter is a Chris chapter. It's like, do I know exactly what's going to happen in there? No. I know I need to get back to this character because it's been 5 chapters since you've spoken to him. So it's anything you can do to kind of start building a framework. And like Mike said, these things are, you know, it's a Word document. You can erase things and put them in as much as you want. You can move things. It's like, it's great for that reason because nothing has to be solid until that, you know, second draft. But certainly moving things in an outline is so much easier. And that's the real benefit of an outline, is the fact that it's like, this scene, like I need something that's gonna kind of like, oh, I've been talking about government crap for like this chapter, somebody needs to get punched in the mouth. You know, it's like, so that's the nice thing about having that outline, is you can, you know, like I need something that kind of moves things along here. So that's, you know, I really, like I said, the book I'm working on now, the outline's like 30 pages, because it's just, you know, it's the only way I can make it work, so.
I don't want to cut people off, but it's time, because we're going to give up the room to another panel, but thank you all for coming. We are all in the, you know, the ballroom in the outskirts, so please come visit us. If you have questions, just bring them over, we'll all answer.